Greetings from South Africa, Suid-Afrika, Afrique du Sud. I am joined today by Ernst Roets, and I am Conscious Caracal. Welcome, Ernst. I understand you are streaming live from New York City, am I correct?
That is correct. Thank you very much. It's good to speak to you. Good to be on the show.
Oh, excellent, man. Well, you've got a big week ahead of you still, even though you've already have an entire week behind you. Just for context sake and for everyone listening that might not have been following along that thoroughly, can you just give a little example of why are you in South Africa, who are you with, and what is your mission?
In America. Yes, so we've been here the whole of last week, and we will be here for this week as well. Last week we spent the whole week in Washington, D.C. We're currently in New York. I'm sitting in a hotel room in Manhattan, just about a block away from the Empire State Building. And the reason why we're here is to raise awareness in our campaign against farm murders and expropriation without compensation. We're actually a delegation of 3 people, although it's myself and then Marina, Wiese, our communications manager, and also Mariandra, Heunis. Mariandra actually departed. She left today. She's currently on an airplane flying back to South Africa. She wasn't able to spend the whole 2 weeks with us. And so we are here to speak to as many people as we can about what's happening in South Africa, about the push by the South African government to change the constitution or review the constitution, and of course the scourge of farm killings, particularly after the tweet made by President Donald Trump, and particularly after President Cyril Ramaphosa came to the US just a few blocks away from here and said that there's no such thing as farm killings and farm attacks in South Africa. So the purpose of this trip is to speak to as many people as we can, to raise awareness, but also to get some form of action. And by action, we also mean, well, we include public statements about what's happening in South Africa.
And this is not your first tour in America. This is actually your second one. The first one also got a lot of publicity in the media. So this is almost like a follow-up on it. And can you describe is there any difference in terms of not only the people that the way or the feedback that you're getting this time, but also in terms of publicity or awareness rather, compared to the first time?
Yes. So it's not even my second time, but yes, I've been here a few times, but it's the second time that it's the first time after last year when it received substantial news coverage. And there is a few differences that we can pick up. The one is that people are much better aware now, people we speak to. Almost all of them at least knew to an extent that there's something happening in South Africa. And I think some of the interviews we've done earlier helped a lot, but I think the major thing here was the tweet by Donald Trump about what's happening in South Africa. It seemed to have made quite a big impact. We knew it made a big impact in South Africa, but it seemed also to have made a big impact in the US among people who weren't really interested in South Africa. So everyone knows there's something happening. Of course, some are more informed than others. But I think that's the most significant difference, is that we don't have to introduce ourselves. Many already have an idea who AfriForum is and what we stand for. Some of them have said to me, "Oh, I recognize you from Fox News when you were on last year," and people know there's something happening in South Africa.
Well, it's good to hear that there is actually, you can perceive a difference in terms of not only the awareness levels, but also in terms of just talking to, I mean, you're not talking to the average American, you're talking to some high profile people. And on that note, can you tell the audience can you give us any idea of who have you met with, and what was your experience with them?
Yes, so we spoke with a wide variety of people, to such an extent that I'm actually really quite tired now, because we had a very busy week in Washington, to the extent where sometimes we had to run from one meeting to the next because they were packed like sardines. I think the easiest way to explain who we spoke with is to categorize it. So we've spoken with many in the media. much more than last time we were here. I counted. I think we've done probably around 20 radio interviews so far. Some of them broadcast across the entire US, others broadcast in particular states or particular areas. So it's national or nationwide and local radio. And I think that's been the most significant. No, it's hard to say the most. It's been one of the significant parts of this trip is we've really spoken to millions of people through radio shows, which we haven't done earlier. Then we've done more media than last time we were here. Although it hasn't been published yet. So last night I was at Fox News again, although the previous time I spoke with Fox News in Washington. Yesterday I spoke with Fox News in New York. This is actually their headquarters, although they have a studio in Washington as well. I've been on One American News Network. We had quite a long interview. I'm guessing like 20 minutes. It hasn't been published yet. I've spoken with Eric Bowling, who's a very well-known journalist in the US. I believe it will be published on The Blaze. He actually, the day after he interviewed me, he interviewed Donald Trump at the White House. So it's not just some, fringe journalist. Then we also had, and Mariandra particularly had a very striking interview. Mariandra Heunis, of course, who survived the farm attack, whose husband was murdered in 2016, had a very striking interview on the Daily Caller. And they have literally millions of people on their Facebook page. It will be online. And it really had a big impact on everyone who was there. So I suspect that Mariandra's interview will go viral on social media once it's published. I don't know when. I'm guessing next week sometime. And obviously we will share it. We've spoken with quite a few. We were supposed to speak with BuzzFeed yesterday. That was postponed to today. So we'll speak with him today. We spoke with Vice and a whole list of others. So that's on the media side. We also spoke with the State Department, with the government, the US government in Washington. And we had a very good meeting. We spoke for, I'm guessing, an hour and a half about what's happening on the farms and what's happening with expropriation without compensation. Mariandra told her story to them, and it was also very, very striking. Then we spoke with a whole bunch of think tanks. They have a very big think tank culture in the US. I don't think there's a country in the world that has as many think tanks as the city of Washington has, just in the area around Capitol Hill. So for those that don't know, a think tank is basically a research organization. Oftentimes they would have a particular focus area or a particular frame of reference. It would be, for example, a liberal think tank or a libertarian think tank or a conservative think tank. And they would focus on particular issues like the environment or crime or domestic policy or foreign policy and so forth. And it's a full-time research organization, and they publish reports continuously, and they do interviews, and then the reports are read by politicians, by people in government, and they use those reports to make decisions. So we spoke with quite a few think tanks, and then the other thing that I think was very significant about this trip is the amount of people we spoke with on Capitol Hill. Now, Capitol Hill is, to put it in South African terms, is the Parliament of the USA. So they have the House and the Senate. And we spoke to as many people as we can there. We had many meetings with Republicans and Democrats. And we particularly zoomed in on people who are on the foreign affairs committees, who are obviously more interested in what's happening in South Africa. And I suspect that there would be some form of a statement coming from those quarters as a result of this trip. I don't expect it to be today or in the next week. Actually, we encourage people not to try and make a statement, just as soon as possible, but to look into the matter, and we will send them more information. And also, I believe the appropriate time to do this would be after the elections, but not only after the elections, once the next step is taken by the South African government to change the constitution. which would probably be once the text is published. In other words, how do they want to change the constitution? They would have to draft something. And I'm sure we would get reaction from Washington at that stage. And I think that would largely be as a result of this trip. So I think the trip has been very, very fruitful so far.
Right. And I think your whole philosophy with this trip actually links up quite well with one of my mottos on my channel, which is don't just believe what I say, research what I say. And I think that is the best policy or any advice I could give to anyone that wants to learn about South Africa. Don't just take the word of anyone. I mean, it doesn't even matter what narrative or facts they provide you with, or facts in big air quotes, but rather take what they're telling you and do your own research. I mean, you're going to have to go a bit out of your way, but at the same time, it's going to be worth your while. You're going to be more informed, and you're going to be much more immune to being hoodwinked by propaganda. Now, a big question that I've seen in the chat, but also leading up to this interview on social media, is the question, why exactly America? I mean, there's an entire world out there of countries that have a large amount of people that seem very interested in South Africa. But you've made 2 trips now already to America. Could you maybe elaborate more on your reasoning or your rationale there?
Well, firstly, so my portfolio in AfriForum includes liaison with the US, the USA, not so much with other countries. That's in terms of my own activities, but we have been to many other countries. So last year we had a trip to Australia. Ian Cameron was there, spoke with a whole bunch of people. He was interviewed on Sky News as well. Alana Bailey, my colleague, has gone to Europe several times. I think the reason why, so there are many countries that are important to speak to. I think the reason why the US in particular is important is firstly because it's a global superpower, to use the buzzword. It has the most, or at least a significant amount of influence, if not the most, in world politics. Also, we do know that the South African government is very sensitive to international criticism, even more so, at least seemingly even more so when it comes from the USA. Then added to that, I think it's important to speak to the USA because there's an underlying problem in what's happening in South Africa in terms of it, and it's relevant when we're talking about farm murders. It's relevant when we're talking about the economy, when we're talking about expropriation without compensation, about minority rights and all of these things. And that is the very strong anti-Western sentiment that we see within the South African government and the ruling party and its alliances. It's also important to speak to the USA because of the role that China is playing in South Africa. That has been quite a trigger to many people that they should take note of what's happening in South Africa. It's not just a South African problem. It's something that would have consequences for the USA as well because of the competition between the USA and China. Also, it's important to speak to the USA because of the tweet made by President Donald Trump and his instruction to Secretary of State Mike Pompeo that they would have to investigate what's happening in South Africa. There's actually a long list, and let's give 2 more reasons. The other one is, of course, the fact that President Ramaphosa came to the USA in, I think it was September, if I recall, and said in New York that there's no land grabs happening in South Africa and there's no farm murders happening in South Africa, which, of course, isn't true. And then the last reason that's, I think, important is that the USA actually played quite a role in the years 1992 to 1994 to get the ANC to power. I spoke with someone during our visit here who worked with the CIA or who had some historic links to them, who said to me that the extent to which the USA was involved at that time is often underestimated. In other words, they played a particular role in getting us to where we are now. And of course, that was largely, I believe, by the Bill Clinton administration. And I think it's important, at least for that reason, to take, for people in the USA, I would say that they have a moral obligation, at least to speak out about what's happening in South Africa as a result of the fact that the USA played a role in getting us where we are today. So there's a long list of reasons why should be speaking to the USA and why we will be coming back again.
Right. It's very interesting that you mention the influence that the US had during apartheid, because that's actually an element or a part of our history or a part of the whole struggle that is not given that much attention. It's all Russia, 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 rooi gevaar. But at the same time, it was it was the guys telling us about the rooi gevaar in the end. But now I see, well, on a lighter note, a lot of people in the chat are big fans of your jacket. They want to know where they can get one. And then Don Barnard in the chat says, radio is very underrated. Good choice, Ernst. Yeah, no, I agree. It seems that radio is in fact not dead. Now, just a bit more of on that topic of why America, I want to shift that a bit. Do you think it would be a plausible prediction, not prediction, but do you think it would be plausible in the future to send a delegation, an AfriForum delegation to, for example, Europe, where there's also a lot of support being shown for the cause of bringing awareness to farm murders, but also in terms of land expropriation? Is that a possibility maybe in the future?
Yes. So as I've said, we have actually already been there. Alana Bailey was in England and in some European countries last year to speak to people in government and politicians and so forth. So we are actually already doing this. I think the trips to the US seem to get more attention because of the maybe, I don't know if perception is the right word, but let's say because of the perception that exists about who the United States are, and the fact that the US is this major super or global power. So yeah, we are going to. We've been to Europe and we've been to North America and we've been to Australia. We've been to several countries in Europe already.
No, thanks for that clarification, because that's actually a big theme I see in the questions directed your way the past week. Was firstly, why America? And then secondly, why not X, Y, and Z? Now, you touched on something else very important, and that is China's influence in Africa. Now, that's also something that I don't think a lot of people pay attention to. Could you, man, I think because it's so important, could you maybe elaborate a bit more on, in terms of, firstly, your impression of, do you think America has given up on Africa in terms of their influence and their footprint here? Have they left it just for the Chinese to expand their influence? Or is there still a very strong sentiment in America that they need to keep their presence in Africa here? But also, as a second question, could you elaborate a bit more in terms of their concerns regarding Chinese influence?
Yes, I don't think they've given up on Africa. But look, the point is that lawmakers and decision makers in the USA don't lay awake at night in their beds thinking about South Africa and how what's wrong with South Africa and how are they going to solve it. They lie awake thinking about their own problems, and they have enough of their own problems to deal with. But they are interested in what's happening in South Africa to the extent that it's relevant to their problems. And there's a few things that we've seen. One is, it depends on who you speak with. So there are many people, especially more on the liberal side, more on the Democrat side, who are very much driven by the notion of human rights and uplifting Africa and solving poverty in Africa. So in those quarters, the message of the destructive consequences of expropriation without compensation, that message is important. And also the fact that if, unfortunately, among the more people more to the left in the USA as in South Africa, it's not very politically correct to talk about, especially, let's say, white farmers in South Africa. But the notion that the destruction of the economy or a downward spiral of the economy would affect poor black people more than white people who would just leave the country resonates in those quarters. While on the more conservative, actually, I think there's a broad concern about China, the role that China is playing in global politics, although you would find more Republicans talk about China more. I think Democrats are also concerned about this. That's at least my view or my experience, but you don't hear them talking about it as much. So what's happening in South Africa is relevant, I think, to people on the right because of their strong opinions about socialism and communism and so forth, and the fact that they believe they see people in the USA flirting with the same type of ideas, and they want them to learn the lessons that should be learned from South Africa. But I think the role that China is playing and the role that Russia is playing to a small extent resonates with people. I think Russia is a trigger to Democrats in the US, and China is maybe a little bit more to Republicans. So yes, it is, and it is important. We know about the arms deal with Russia, all the corruption that goes along with it, the push to build for the Russian government to build nuclear power plants in South Africa. And in terms of China, we know that that's particularly relevant, particularly with regard to land reform. We've seen what happened with Akkerland Boerdery, which is actually the farm across the street from where I grew up in Limpopo, in Zanin. And we know that that's the farm, if people forgot, it's worth, in US dollar terms, the farm is worth about $20 million, or was worth. And then they were given notice by the South African government that their property is going to be expropriated. They can't expropriate without compensation. So they decided that $2 million is appropriate. And it turns out that there's a massive coal supply on the farm, and China is interested in that because there's a massive Chinese investment project in Limpopo nearby. We've also heard people, I particularly remember Julius Malema saying that in Parliament, but there were people in the ANC saying the same thing, that we are now in South Africa at the point where, for the first time ever, people in South Africa are investing more money abroad than people abroad are investing in South Africa. And when you say that to politicians, the ANC and the EFF and so forth, many of them would say, well, that's not a problem if people take their investments and go, because that just leaves room for China to come in. And the increasing role that China is playing in South Africa is something that people in the USA are very interested in. And I think it sort of opens the door to more discussions about what's happening.
Well, what you also can do is you can maybe even bring up the whole idea of South Africa supporting Venezuela, doing what do you call it, a fact-finding mission, if I'm correct, to Venezuela to go see what a model prosperous state and how it works.
Yeah. Now, sorry, if I could just say something about that. That was quite alarming to, I would say, at least in the reaction, the response that we had, it was quite alarming to the Republicans and the Democrats, or equally alarming to the Republicans and the Democrats we spoke with, at least. The Venezuelan trip. And the fact that they went there was a news report, and they came back, and I remember the spokesperson for this trip said that, the people in Venezuela are not as unhappy as people say. They saw people partying in the streets. It reminded me of North Korea, where they have those mock parties and things, just this propaganda parties to let people think that it's going
the plastic fruit in the windows.
Yes, exactly. So the ANC delegation saw people partying in the streets. And they went to Venezuela. Apparently the country is so great that people are literally partying outside in the streets.
Of course, it's all propaganda, Ernst.
Yes, exactly. But then they also said, no, there are problems in Venezuela. They cannot deny that. But those are the faults of the US government. So for some reason, everything goes back to the USA. And we see that in South Africa, Gweri Mantashe has spoken about how the USA should be blamed for what's happening in South Africa, how the CIA is plotting to overthrow the South African government. And we saw that in Zimbabwe, and South African politicians say the same thing about Zimbabwe, that the reason why the economy failed in Zimbabwe is not because of Mugabe's land reform policies, it's because of the USA. So it always goes back to the imperialist forces. And I think what's also significant, and I told this story to a few people and they all bursted out laughing, was the South African ambassador in Venezuela last year, who said that the South African government is prepared to take up arms against the USA. And I haven't said this to anyone who didn't start laughing when they heard it. So I think that the role, that what's happening in Venezuela and the view of the ruling party regarding Venezuela is it resonates with people here. And there's another thing that people in the US talk to us about. When they see them, they say to us, "Is it true that there was a book burning ceremony in South Africa?"
Oh.
So people heard about what happened with this book about ANC corruption, and people have asked us about what's happening with that. And I showed them the advertisement that was spread around in terms of encouraging people to bring their, I can't remember, their propaganda so that they can burn it all. And I mean, that's a trigger that, at least if you think things are going well in South Africa, the fact that the ruling party is organizing a book burning ceremony is very, very significant.
Yeah, and that just leaves me with the question, which part of the fourth industrial revolution involves book burning? And also the idea of Western imperialists ate my homework. That's a socialist proverb. So the next question that I have, and I see someone here in the chat actually asked it, and coincidentally that was on my list of something that I was curious about. Have you encountered any opposition, any hostility to any capacity in the United States, from who, if so?
So far, no one. We haven't spoken with anyone who was hostile. I would say the most. We've spoken with many journalists, of course, and some have said in their interviews. In Fox News, for example, the journalist, the anchor, held up the book and said, "Everyone you need to get this book." So that was, I think, a good compliment and something that we welcome. And many of the radio hosts said the same thing. Some have been very neutral. I would say the most neutral respondent we spoke with would be the State Department, and I think that's their duty. You don't want a State Department, or you shouldn't expect of a State Department, in other words, the US government, to, when we walk out of the meeting, to say, "All right, folks, this is what we're going to do. Here's the plan of action. Let's do this now." That's not how the State Department operates. They get as much information, and unfortunately, they tend to operate slower. They were fairly neutral in terms of speaking to us. They really sympathized with Mariandra, with her story. But no negative feedback, nothing. I saw some tweets that were negative back in South Africa, but everyone we've spoken with, I could see that people had different takes on what we should be focusing on. Some people were very interested in the racial dynamics. Some of the radio stations would say, well, what's happening in South Africa is that white people are being targeted. Others would put a particular focus on the economic side, on the target to property rights and why property rights are important. And others would focus more on the humanitarian side. So everyone has their own spin on what's happening in South Africa and their own piece of the puzzle that's more important to them. But no, nothing negative. Nothing negative.
No, that's excellent to hear. And also, I think everyone is understanding this more and more as time goes by, but social media is not a very accurate representation of reality. I mean, you just have to go out into the real world and talk to some people to realize that the average person is not some, 20 followers troll on Twitter. But now, while we're on the topic in terms of just your influence in America, and while I think over 100 people are watching, how can the people watching and the people that support what you do, how can they do their part in terms of not only supporting you further, what's the best they can do, but also what would you, how can they make sure that this tour is as successful as possible? There might be even more in the future.
Well, we will be working on a strategy, a plan of action while we are here, that we will actually start executing once we're back. But I've learned a lot about the US system and what works and what doesn't work during this trip in particular. I don't think I've ever taken any trip in which I've learned as much as I've learned in the last week or so. And everyone we spoke with, we asked them for advice, and everyone didn't give the same advice, but you could see that there were some consistent themes and there were differences between people, which is also good. But there's a few things that people can do, and the one thing which is very obvious is to be a member of AfriForum, because I think people can fortunately see I don't live we don't have a very big hotel room, so we're trying to make the trip as we're trying to spend as little as we can by coming here, but also it's very expensive because you pay in US dollars, so food is very expensive. Staying in a hotel room is expensive if you pay in rands. So if we didn't have members, and if we didn't have more than 200,000 members, we wouldn't have been able to be here. I think it's very important to keep coming back once a year, at least given the circumstances that we have now, maybe even more, because we shouldn't expect that we're going to solve the problem with one trip or two trips. I think this was my 4th time to Washington, and I can clearly see the trend that every time we come back, we meet new people who we haven't spoken with before, and every time we go back to some people we have spoken with who have been transferred from people who didn't know anything about South Africa into friends, or they've been transferred. We use the terminology from strangers to friends. So we would come back and they would regard us as friends, not as strangers anymore. So we need to come back and grow the network, which is what we're doing. But I'm coming a bit with the going off on a tangent. But to answer your question, there's one thing that I've seen, I think potentially the most impactful thing that people could do. Firstly, if you're in South Africa, to be a member of AfriForum. If you're not in South Africa, to be a member to join Friends of AfriForum. But the one thing that I've seen, and we've spoken to some representatives who have said this to us, so they have to report to their constituencies. They come from particular states or particular districts, and they have a very strong culture in the US of people calling their representatives and discussing issues that they are concerned about. And we've spoken with people who have said to us, we are so grateful to have you here because some of our constituents have called us and have asked us, what are we doing about what's happening in South Africa? And now we can report back to them and say, we've met with some people who are from South Africa. We met with AfriForum and we intend to do the following. So
that's excellent.
I think the most significant thing that we could do, and we're going to develop an entire plan of action around that we will communicate in probably the months that follow, is for people who are in the USA to call their representatives, to find out who it is, to give them a call or send them an email. Email might be better. Well, no, I think both, an email and a phone call, and say, I'm very concerned about what's happening in South Africa. What have you done? Or what have you said about South Africa? Because that provides a further incentive for that representative to take a stance, to go back and report to his constituency, to the people who voted for him or her, and show that they've done something. I think that's very, very important, and it really is significant, and it is impactful, and we've seen it during our trip here.
Right, now I can just by looking at the chat here, I can tell you already. So Jonathan says, I'm a proud member, Ernst. Sunshine Savannah says, me too. Brett says, I'm a member of Friends of AfriForum. Jock says, trots I'm a member at the Wiese. And Sideliner Opinion says, Zimbabwe did not have the luxury of having an AfriForum organization. So yeah, the support is streaming in. And just on a smaller note, in terms of how you can help the person that's listening right now, how you can help my channel, leave a like on the stream at the moment. There's still a half an hour left or even more of the interview. And also share this link on WhatsApp or somewhere on Twitter with people that you think might be interested. I'm enjoying this very much so far, and I'm glad to see over 100 people have already signed in or tuned in, rather. Thank you very much for giving us the time of your day. Now, another question for me, for you rather, Ernst, is what's lying ahead this week? Is there any type of reveals or any type of just a little appetizer you can give us in terms of what's still on your agenda?
Yes. Well, what I should say, there's something that I actually forgot to say when we spoke about what we have done, and I'll get to what's ahead. I think something that was very, very significant during our visit to Washington is there's a movement called Americans for Tax Reform. It's headed by Grover Norquist, who's very influential, at least in conservative circles in Washington. And it's a pressure group. I believe it's a more informal pressure group. They meet every week, and people from all over Washington send representatives. George W. Bush had a representative attend those meetings for the whole of the time when he was in office. And I've been there before, and I had the team of Paul Ryan, for example, do a presentation. So it's a very, very influential group. They meet every Wednesday, and you're not allowed to film anything or to discuss what was said at the meetings. But what I can say is that we were given the opportunity to actually do a presentation there about what's happening in South Africa. And there were about 200 people there from all over Washington, from people from government, people from the Senate, people from the House, and they were very interested. You could see from the reactions in the audience about what's happening in South Africa. So just that's in terms of last week. I think in terms of what lies ahead, it's mostly meetings with people and interviews, radio interviews, seeing some people in New York. I think the tour will make some eruptions once the interviews we've done starts getting published. And I've jokingly said to my colleague that there might be, I don't know if it's true, but there might be more journalists, certainly more politicians, but there might be more journalists and politicians in the USA who have now read Kill the Boer than journalists and politicians in South Africa. So that's very good. I think there's still a few on my shelf there behind me. We brought a whole bunch of copies with us. The bag was full. Yes, I see there's...
Yeah, here's my copy.
And we've been handing it out to people, obviously handing out signed copies. And you could see in the interviews we've had that in many of them you could hear that the person who we spoke with actually read the book. They would say like, oh, in chapter 15 you make a comment about this, please tell us more about this. Or they would say, I read that about land reform, there's some interesting statistics. So people are very interested. And it's good to hear so many people having said that, please go and buy this book and please read this book. It's important for people in the USA to know what's happening. And of course, I think your viewers probably know that I'm not making any money from the book. We just want the book to be distributed as much as we can. And maybe if I can make a comment about the book, I'm sure people know the book has achieved international bestseller status on Amazon.
Oh, that's excellent.
The way you achieve that is within the category that the book is listed. It must be within a period of 24 hours. It must be the #1 selling book in more than one country. And if you achieve that, it's listed as an international bestseller. Where we are now in terms of sales in South Africa, we've had 4,000 sales in South Africa. To be a bestseller in terms of hard copies in South Africa, you need to sell 5,000. So we are printing the next batch now. Caracal Uitgewers is printing the next batch. So if you don't have a copy yet, we would really like for the book, when we come back to the US next year, to be able to say it's a bestseller on Amazon and it's a bestseller in South Africa. And if you can put that on the cover of the book, it also adds to the credibility of the book. And I'm sure we would reach more people if we can achieve.
Well, I will definitely, after the stream, I'll put a link to your book in the description. Oh, a bit of a technical difficulty that I just have to fix. So there's also a link in the description for anyone that's curious that you can click if you want to help support Ernst and AfriForum's tour in America. You can check that out after the stream. And then also, I'm seeing we're still at over 100 people watching. Thank you very much for everyone giving their time. Just maybe as a very short answer for people that are not South African, can you just give your most concise summary of what AfriForum is and what AfriForum stands for as an organization? So
AfriForum is a civil rights organization operating in South Africa. We have more than 218,000 members, which makes us the biggest civil rights group on the African continent. We focus on minority rights within South Africa, and we stand for the protection of property rights. We stand for the promotion of freedom and liberty, to use those terms. And in terms of why we are in the US, we particularly also campaign for something to be done about the farm murders and the violence that we see on the farms in South Africa. Of course, we do a whole lot of other stuff as well, but I think in terms of why we are here, those are probably the most important.
Right. And I mean, you yourself also have a pretty nice CV of credentials. I mean, you are the yes, die adjunkhoof van AfriForum.
Yeah,
but at the same time, English is failing me there for a second. But at the same time, also you've produced the documentary Tainted Heroes. You were the director. Also, the DisruptedLand that came out this year. That's been a smash hit. You wrote Kill the Boer, and also you're a very strange character in the South African political arena. In terms of, I think you're the type of person that's loved by many, but also despised by a few. So there's no real middle ground, and it's just something interesting that I've, in terms of how I see the public reacting, and I think I can actually connect that to this tour as well. The vast majority of people, whether they be left or right or whatever, are actually in support of it because they see the value in it. They can put their ideology aside, and they can see that this is helping South Africa in the long term, and that it's not motivated by something sinister. Now, on that note of not being motivated by something sinister, or rather what you're trying to achieve, something that comes up a lot, and you put it in your media release as well, is the whole idea of the AGOA agreement. Now, what can you tell us exactly? What are you trying to achieve surrounding it? Are you, just elaborate in terms of on that very topic of the AGOA agreement. What would your base case scenario be?
Yes. So some of the people we've spoken with on Capitol Hill in Washington we weren't even able to finish our point, and they started asking, what leverage do we have, or what can we do? I think the AGOA agreement is very significant between the US and South Africa and some other countries as well. The AGOA agreement is very beneficial to South Africa in terms of job creation and so forth, and we want to stay in that agreement. It's good for us. But the good news is that that agreement particularly states that to be a party of that agreement, you have to respect property rights. And so what could potentially happen, especially with someone like Donald Trump in the White House, is if the South African government changes the constitution, you could hear unexpectedly the USA announcing, well, we're stepping out of this agreement. You broke the agreement, so we're stepping out. And that's not something that we want to happen in South Africa. It would have a negative impact. But we believe something that could happen is we should at least push the message that there is an agreement. The agreement is good for South Africa. But if they want to stay in this agreement, they have to respect property rights. And I am sure that this message would be amplified after this trip. As I said, not immediately. I don't think you would hear this coming from Washington next week. But I think the AGOA agreement is very important and very significant in terms of what we hope to achieve and what we hope to prevent in South Africa.
Now, on a different note, again, I know you've not been really in mass speaking to the average American out there, but at the same time, gathering what you gather from the people that you have spoken with, your honest opinion, what is their level or capacity of what is their level of understanding of in terms of the South African election? Are they aware of it? Are they aware of the parties involved? Are they aware of the influence levels of the parties? Just in general, their knowledge in terms of the South African election this year. Could you enlighten us on that?
Yes. So the people in Washington they know there's an election coming up. They know it seems like the EFF is growing. They know the ANC will win, or at least most of them. Some people have asked questions such as, is it true that the EFF will get more votes than the DA? And people have questions like that. And some people have asked questions like, how is it that Julius Malema is spearheading this whole thing when he's not in the ruling party? How is it that the ruling party is basically towing the line that the third biggest party is dictating? So people are aware. I don't think the average person in the US I know the average person in the US isn't very informed about South Africa. I've had, during a previous trip to New York, I thought it was quite funny. I spoke to someone in Barnes & Noble, the bookstore here on Fifth Avenue, and they asked me, they recognized my accent, and they said, are you, well, no, they asked me where, they recognized that I don't have an American accent, and they asked me, where are you from? And I said, I'm from South Africa. And they said, oh, which country? So for them, there's North Africa, and that's also an interesting point. And I saw Dirk Skeepers is on the chat. I spoke with him on his podcast last night about this as well. So South Africa is just a term. It's basically just a regional term. So the North Africa means Egypt and Algeria and all of those countries. And West Africa means Ghana and Sierra Leone and Liberia and all those countries. And East Africa means Kenya and Tanzania and Uganda and those countries, or Tanzania. And South Africa is one country. And I think there's a bigger political dimension in that, about to what extent is this sustainable. But to get to your question, no. I think I don't know if I can speak about the average person in Washington, but I could at least say the people on Capitol Hill and people who are in some ways involved with government that we spoke with have an idea about what's happening in South Africa, and the average person do not.
Well, on that note, have you been speaking to at least some people on the street, like average Americans? Have you indulged a bit in terms of picking their brains at some opportunities?
Not so much. Well, I mean, we speak to people all the time when we go and have takeaway, or when we go into a shop or something. We do that, but we've been speaking to so many people about what's happening in South Africa in terms of meetings and interviews and so forth, that we don't really speak to, waiters and people on the subway about what's happening in South Africa. We've spoken with a few, but and they are always very shocked to hear. They would typically ask, okay, well, what's happening in South Africa? And when we tell them what's going on, some would say, oh, yes, I've heard of it, and others would be completely shocked, especially about the farm murders, and especially with Mariandra Heunis here. When she tells her story to people, it's I saw people crying when she told her what she went through and what her family went through.
And then also a question I got on Twitter today that I think is actually pretty good and it kind of links to a question that I was planning to ask anyway, is the idea of, so there are people that argue that there might be more effective ways at spreading awareness, getting support in foreign countries. But then also one of the suggestions was, or one of the questions was, why don't you go to the US embassy in South Africa? Why don't you work through that channel to spread awareness and get in contact with contacts in the US?
Yeah, well, we actually do that as well. So me and Kali Kriel we've had a meeting at the US embassy, or at least people from the US embassy. I think November or December. I think we issued a press statement about that afterwards. So we have done that, and we will continue to do that. But the US embassy is only one small part of the bigger puzzle that is US politics. So the US embassy reports to the State Department, and it's better to speak to the State Department in Washington because you speak to more people, and you speak to the people to whom the South African embassy report, and you speak to the people who are tasked with writing the reports that would be filed to the Secretary of State. So we do that, and we will continue to do that, but it's important, unfortunately, because it's more expensive, but it is important to actually go to the country and speak to politicians, and because politicians and the government is not the same thing. So you need to speak to the government, and you need to speak to politicians, and you need to speak to the actual think tanks. So we can email the think tanks, and we can email, for example, the Heritage Foundation or whoever, and give them information, and we do that as well. But in terms of networking and liaison, there's nothing as effective as sitting down in the office around a table, having a cup of coffee together, and just talking. And what I've also noticed, and I've seen that, and maybe that's important also, I've seen that there's this group, and I'm sure the viewers would know of them, known as the intellectual dark web on the internet.
Yeah.
And I've seen it among probably 3 of them already, that they are quite interested in what's happening in South Africa, but they are sort of concerned because they don't know who they should speak to, because there's so much conflicting information out there. There's people saying, there's President Ramaphosa saying there's no such thing as farm murders. And then we have people saying there's a genocide happening. And then we have people saying, yes, there are farm murders, but it's not as bad as other crimes.
And sorry to interject there, but I mean, this is the president of South Africa assuring you that there aren't any land grabs and there aren't any farm murders going on. If I was the average American, I mean, I would give a lot of weight to the opinion of the South African president. If you are just someone that is not that well informed about South Africa or what's going on or who the ANC are or whatever, I would think, okay, the president is saying this, it can't be that bad.
Yes, exactly. So we've seen that, especially with the think tanks and commentators as well, journalists and so forth, that they know there's something happening. They know of AfriForum. They don't know enough. And once you sit down with that person and you get to ask lots of questions about detailed things, and unfortunately, it's a problem in the US as well, but it's a problem in South Africa as well, that we at AfriForum get a lot of criticism that isn't funded in fact. So we've been criticized for stuff that we've said, and then we would stand by it and say, yes, this is our opinion. But sometimes we would be accused of stuff in news outlets that's supposed to be credible. They would just accuse AfriForum of stuff that isn't true. So to have that personal conversation is very effective, and I think there's a lot more that should be done. I mentioned this intellectual dark web is one aspect. We haven't spoken with them really, but at least people in Washington and the think tanks, you can see that once you speak with them personally, they see, okay, well, so you are credible. And they ask questions. They would say, well, what's your view on this? And what's your position on that? And you can answer the questions, and they say, okay, well, you're not, they might have read something in Huffington Post or in News 24 or somewhere, and they can test what they've read to who you actually are. And unfortunately, we've seen as AfriForum, and again, it's true of many people, that we get criticized for a lot of things that aren't true. And we're able to debunk that.
Right. And on the note of propaganda, I think if I remember correctly, you even tweeted it out because you were very chuffed about it. You bought a new book for you by Thomas Sowell. And the opening line of that book is actually very applicable to exactly what you were saying. Would you mind sharing that with the audience?
I've actually read two books already since I've been here, because we don't go out doing stuff in the evenings. So this is my third book I'm reading since I've been here. I'll read you the first sentence. Here we go. So the book is called Economic Facts and Fallacies by Thomas Sowell. The first sentence in the book is, some things are believed because they are demonstrably true, but many other things are believed simply because they've been asserted repeatedly, and repetition has been accepted as a substitute for evidence. And I mean, that's exactly what we see. I've read the first chapter, I'm busy with the second chapter now, and it's as if this book was written in South Africa for people in South Africa. So I haven't finished it yet, but I can really, really recommend this book. I think it's very, very striking. The parts I've read so far is very relevant to the type of fallacies that we see in South Africa and how to debunk them as well.
Yeah. And in contrast with your previous live stream when you had your first tour in America, this quote can't really be taken out of context and used against you in a malicious way.
Yes, yes, exactly. So no, I think it's useful, and I mean, we'd love to speak to Thomas Sowell as well. I believe he's in New York, but
baby steps, Ernst.
Yeah. No, I think we're doing quite well.
Yeah, but I won't tell the audience about your meeting with Donald Trump just yet.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh no, I'm sorry. It's just John Bolton. So to add on that idea, you've talked this week, or one of the interviews was postponed. You've talked to Vice News, and you have also have a postponed interview of BuzzFeed, right?
Yes.
So
BuzzFeed
right?
today.
Yeah. I think from a more basic perspective, a lot of people would have told you it's not worth it to talk to those types of outlets because they are notorious for taking you out of context, editing interviews. What was your rationale behind accepting those types of interviews with organizations that are infamous for not being that ethical in that regard?
Well, we speak to as many people as we can, and and that's one of the things that we get criticized for that really isn't true, is that we allegedly only speak to conservatives or right wingers in America in terms of politicians and in terms of media. So we've spoken with Fox News, we've spoken with just in the last year, not all of them in the US, some of them in South Africa. We've spoken with Fox News, we've spoken with CNN, with ABC, with Reuters, with Sky News, with Vice, BuzzFeed. The list goes on. And then out of that, people say, "Oh, you're only speaking to right wingers because Fox News is on the list," which doesn't make sense. It's completely irrational. But I think it's important to. I know people have said, "Oh, don't speak to BuzzFeed or don't speak to Vice." Actually, our meeting with Vice went very well yesterday. They haven't written something yet. It wasn't an interview for a story. It was more a discussion about getting background information and understanding what's happening in South Africa. So they will be sending a team to South Africa to report on what's happening there. And I think our conversation went very well. And I would gladly speak to people at BuzzFeed. I mean, we've experienced that that sometimes we get interviewed by people, and it would be more mainstream news outlets, and then they would edit what you said afterwards. I mean, we've had it happen to us as well. And one example was once, maybe some of the viewers will remember, it happened in 2015. I'm not going to say who, but a current affairs show came to our offices and interviewed me about farm attacks. And they asked me, is it true that I'm sort of oversimplifying a bit because it happened years ago, but they asked me, is it true that only white people are murdered during farm attacks? And I responded and I said, no, it's not true, because they oftentimes kill the workers and black farmers are also killed. And then it was interpreted more or less along the lines, or packaged more or less along the lines that there's no racial element to farm attacks, and AfriForum agrees. And then they show that section of me saying that. And of course, that's a misrepresentation. And we've been criticized for that. But I mean, that's part of the game. It's part of what we do. It's not always fun. And sometimes you get attacked for things you didn't say or for things that is reported out of context. But if we were to try to prevent that from ever happening, then we would never be able to do anything. So that's why I like discussions like these longer format discussions, because you can spend time to explain your position on something. And I think that's what's exciting about what's happening in the world of news and of media with podcasts and YouTube channels. That,
right.
I mean, we'll continue doing what we're doing, and we'll continue saying what we're saying. And sometimes we will be misrepresented. Sometimes we'll be attacked for things that we haven't said. Sometimes we'll be attacked for a misrepresentation of what we said, or an incorrect interpretation thereof. But I mean, we just need to keep going.
And the thing about this interview is that you don't have to worry that I'm going to edit it out of context. I mean, it's live. So
Yes.
yeah, on that note though, I'm glad to hear that you are actually talking to a lot of people across the ideological line, because I think you can remember from my identity reveal video, that's one of the themes that I'm trying to achieve in South Africa. And I mean, if I can see that type of approach also reflected in someone else's strategy, it gives me a little bit of hope. It shows me that the world isn't becoming irreversibly polarized. And I'm glad that you've talked to Republicans, but also Democrats, and to hear that from both of those sides, you are getting support in some capacity. And just by looking at the chat so far, overwhelming support for AfriForum, overwhelming support for your tour. And now, on the idea of support, have you, in your time in America so far, have you heard back from anyone else that you met with the first time that have been followed, that have actually blatantly told you they've been following since you talked to them the last time?
Oh yes, no, that has definitely happened, and it actually happened the previous time we were here, and last time when me and Kali Kriel were in Washington, we received an email from someone who works on Capitol Hill, and actually said, "Well, I've been following AfriForum for a while, and I've been watching a lot of your stuff on YouTube, and I've been reading a bunch of your interviews, and I saw on the internet that you are in Washington, and we would like to meet you." So that has already happened, where people contacted us just because they knew who we are from before we came to Washington. But yes, we spoke to quite a few people who we've met with earlier, and you can clearly see that they are much more informed about South Africa than they were from last time we spoke. Not only based on what we said to them, but they knew more or less what happened after we went back last time. So that's definitely the case. And there was, I don't know if it was published, but there was an article that was written for the Boston Globe about AfriForum's international strategy. And the journalist, the journalist used the term grassroots diplomacy to describe AfriForum's strategy. And she was referring to the fact that we're trying to reach ordinary people in the US through the media to get them to put pressure on their representatives, as that it's not the only part of our strategy, but I think this really works. And this notion of speaking to more people, coming back, or going back to South Africa, staying in touch through email, coming back again, meeting more people. And every time we end the meeting by saying, who do you think we should speak to? And so I have a list of people currently that we should be speaking to who we haven't spoken with yet. And
on the next trip.
On the next trip, we'll do that. And the great thing about this is people write introductions for you. So we had one person in Washington who sent out, I don't know, probably 10, 20 emails to people in the Senate and the House. Said, listen, I met with AfriForum last time they were here. They are credible. They know what they're doing. You can speak with them. Please meet with them if you can. And we met with many of them. Others have said they're not available currently, but they would like to meet with us when we come back. And we met many people this time around who I'm absolutely convinced would do the same thing. So we're now at the point where if we organize a trip like this to Washington next year, and we book a week in Washington, I can already say with a great degree of confidence that 1 week would not be enough. So if we spent a week in Washington, we would have to pick and choose who are we going to speak with and who not. So we're now at the point where we sometimes have to say no to people. That's not where we want to be, but it's a good problem to have. It's good excellent. To have the problem of not having enough time to speak with everyone. It's much better than having the problem of having excessive amount of time, but there's no one you can speak with.
That's like when you go for a job interview and they ask you, what are your weaknesses? And you say, oh, man, I just work too hard, eh?
Yeah. Yes, exactly.
So no, it's excellent to hear that you're making an imprint. I'm especially encouraged by the news that people remember you from the previous trip and that you've stayed in contact. I mean, this is my first article in the Rational Standard was published just a few days ago. And this was the idea I was trying to convey, the idea of you shouldn't be waiting for someone smarter, richer, stronger, more well-spoken than yourself to do something or say something. You have the power within yourself to start doing that. And this is what I'm seeing through what AfriForum is doing here. AfriForum is rolling up its sleeves and saying, we're going to do something. We might not be the most effective. You might not execute it perfectly, but we are at least doing something. And that's very admirable. The idea of that is the type of organization that I'm proud to be a part of, that at least I'm getting my hands dirty. I'm doing something where I am grabbing the bull by its horns in my own little capacity. And at the same time, just looking at the chat, reading the comments that I have gotten, checking social media, overwhelming support. I mean, it really is. There's a small little loud fringe that are trying to demean the efforts of AfriForum and this whole tour. But the vast majority of people are in support and are saying that they really want to see you succeed in this endeavor. And on that note, firstly, again, thank you for everyone that tuned in. There are links in the description for anyone that wants to support AfriForum or this trip specifically. And there's also a link to Ernst Roets' latest documentary, DisruptedLand. Go give that a watch if you haven't already. Now, also, the thing that I want to end the stream on, because we're winding down now, is the idea of you're in America at the moment, but let's turn that on its head. From America, what message do you want to send to the audience that tuned in today, in terms of not only how they can help, but also maybe if you have anything else to say to them?
You mean the audience? You mean people in South Africa?
Yeah. Well, the people that have tuned in tonight to listen to this interview.
Well, I think that links what you just said about getting your hands dirty, and we've seen that with the people we've spoken with, and it's a general lesson in making a success in life, is you need to determine what is it that you are actually good at. So we've spoken with people who are really intellectually very powerful, in the sense that they can analyze the entire thing, and they can easily quote different philosophers in terms of where we are and what they could strategize and say, what should you do and what shouldn't you do. And then we met people who are really good at execution, who are good at making things happen. And oftentimes those two things are not, oftentimes a person is good at the one and not so much at the other one. And of course there are many other strengths as well. So I think people should find what it is that they are good at. Some people are good at communicating. Other people are good at organizing. Other people are good at, reading and collecting information and distributing it. And I think everyone should, if people focus on what they are good at and zoom in and actually just contribute in some way, then I think it would be very beneficial. I think in terms of getting the message out about what's happening in South Africa, there's a few things. I've said it before, but joining AfriForum really empowers us to do this. If you're not in South Africa, you can join Friends of AfriForum and contribute in that way. And if you are in the US particularly, and it goes for other places in the world as well, but talking now about the US, all your representatives, say to them, listen, I'm concerned about what's happening in the US, and I think you should say something about this, or at least concerned about what's happening in South Africa. I think those three things, and others, not only representatives, we can, people who you think should focus on South Africa, send them tweets, send them comment on their Facebook posts, especially, and here's a tip also for engaging with someone on Twitter. When people have a lot of followers, they don't read all their @mentions. So don't just @mention someone, reply to their tweets. So people read more, people respond more to replies to their own tweets than people who just out of the blue send them a tweet and mentions them. So if you think there's someone who should take notice of what's happening in South Africa, reply to their tweets and say to them, speak to this person, or watch this documentary, or get this book, or whatever. And it's worked with me. But yeah, I think we can really move forward significantly if we do that.
No, I think that's a very positive note to end on. I think that pretty much encapsulates how people can help, because what I see every day are people that are firstly in support of this type of initiative, but also the eagerness to help, to do their little part, whether that be a small contribution or a big one. And I think that's where I want to end this stream on, is the idea of, and you can go check out my article on the Rational Standard, South Africa needs patriots, not apologists or patronizers, where I convey this message a bit more coherently and a bit more in detail. But you have the power within you to also make your little difference. I mean, my YouTube channel was not made, I didn't do like market research and didn't plan to become like this big YouTube channel or start doing interviews with people or anything. It just started as me wanting to put my opinions out there. I'm a Boer with a mic, if you will. And it just took off, and people started tuning in, and people liked what I was saying. And in the end, that little leap of faith actually paid off quite a lot. Now, a lot of people say 2,000 subscribers is nothing. To me, it's a lot. To me, I think it's already a step in the right direction. I'm at least just so thankful to see at least 100 people tune in live to listen to this interview. It's absolutely mind-blowing. Thank you very much, and that's why I want to end it on. Thank you very much for everyone that has tuned in, everyone that has subscribed, everyone that's liked the video, everyone that has shared this stream and my videos and my channel and AfriForum's tour updates with as far as wide as you can, and with anyone that you know. I appreciate it immensely, and I know AfriForum and Ernst Roets and everyone affiliated also appreciates it immensely. And then finally, thank you, Ernst Roets, for giving us more than an hour of your time to give us a bit more detail in terms of what you are trying to achieve in the USA, but also what you already have achieved. I appreciate it a lot, and I know the people that tuned in also appreciate it a lot that you take some time out of your day to give us some clarity.
No, thank you. I've been looking forward to this discussion because, as I said, it provides the opportunity to explain our positions and to explain what we're doing. And I've been keeping an eye on the comments as we were talking, and I saw there were a lot of people. There's someone else saying good luck, Ernst, and there were quite a few people expressing their support. And I mean, thank you. We really appreciate that. So if it wasn't for that, one of the best things that we can do, and that's why I'm stressing becoming a member of AfriForum, is to be able to walk into a meeting with someone in Washington and to say we have more than 200,000 members. It already conveys to that person that they should take us seriously. And again, it wouldn't be possible. We won't be able to pay for this trip if we didn't have members, and we wouldn't receive an audience that regarded us as credible. We wouldn't have been able to make that presentation at Americans for Tax Reform if it wasn't for the fact that we can say how many members we have. And when we say that to people, they say, wow, that's impressive. So yeah, thank you very much, and thank you for speaking to me about this, and thank you for the viewers and for all the support that we're getting.
And I think the label or the achievement of the biggest civil rights organization on the continent of Africa is not something to be sneezed at. I'm gonna stop lauding the audience with compliments again. Thank you for tuning in. Thank you, Ernst Roets, for giving us the time of your day, and also thank you for all the people that participated in the chat. Not only listen, but also put your thoughts out there. I always use it to kind of guide the interview. It helps me formulate my thoughts. You always ask excellent questions. A lot of your questions I did ask. And check you on the next one. I hope you're enjoying the Stream of Consciousness episodes that we've had so far. This is the second episode of 2019. Remember to like the video. Remember to subscribe. And this live interview will also be available on my channel in almost like a catch-up form if you want to watch it again later or even share it with people that you think that might find it interesting. Thank you very much for tuning in. Thank you, Ernst Roets, again. I hope you have a very productive day. I know you've got a lot more daylight hours left than me. It's already dark outside. And I hope everyone else from South Africa have a nice evening ahead of them. And everyone from the rest of the world, I hope you have a nice day or a nice evening or whatever lies ahead. This has been Ernst van Zyl, the Conscious Caracal. Cheers, guys. Have a good one.